Kaleidoscopes implements Kodaly in a unique way, and I wanted to speak to some of the questions of teachers who have perhaps gone through the Kodaly training and are curious about its specific implementation in Kaleidoscopes. One of the strengths of Kodaly is that it's a very flexible approach that allows room for the individual learning situation, the creativity of each individual teacher, and the particular cultural context in which it's being applied. That's one of the reasons that Kodaly educators emphasize that the Kodaly approach is an approach and not a method. The typical Kodaly training levels 1 through 3 is specifically tailored for a general music classroom. So in other words, in the public school, a large group of students, and every student is getting this education. Now, in Hungary, this process starts when the child is 3 years old and enters into nursery school. So by the time a child enters kindergarten, they've now had about 2 years of formal music study already, and they are in a perfect position to begin instrumental study. In the United States, on the other hand, that music education doesn't start until the child is maybe in kindergarten. So if we are getting a child in our violin studio who's starting at the perfect age of 5, they have not necessarily any music literacy already. So we are in the unique position of having to not only teach the child how to play violin, but also fill in 2 years of music literacy that they haven't had, that their age mate in Hungary would already have had. So we are going to possibly need a slightly different approach to get that same job done. Resolving this problem in a general music setting is easy. You just slide everything back 2 years. However, applying this approach to a violin setting is problematic. I worked with a teacher who prided herself on being a pure Kodaly violin teacher, and what this meant to her is that if the child was learning a So-mi song in her group class, she was also working on So-mi songs on the violin. When she was ready to move on to La in the group class, then she would introduce La in the violin class in her repertoire songs. And the problem with this is that the child's musical progress was being really tethered to her literacy progress. Now, in a true Kodaly general music classroom, the way that classroom looks is that out of 45 minutes of class time, about 35 minutes of that is being spent simply performing a wide variety of repertoire that has musical concepts that are way ahead of where the child is in terms of literacy. So they're performing music that has, say, a 5th grade Kodaly concept, while their literacy is at the appropriate age level, 1st grade or whatever. In violin, if you are trying to have the child learning the same material as they have been working on in their literacy context, you are going against one of the fundamental ideas of Kodaly, which is that that child be exposed to a really rich variety of literature, performing literature that they're ready to perform, even if they don't necessarily understand all the concepts yet. Now, a child who's made it to Vivaldi on the violin is still going to have to go through the same literacy steps as any child. So they're still going to have to learn to discriminate So-mi and So-mi La and So-mi Do. However, the act of interacting with the piano, interacting with the violin, is giving that child a whole range more input than if they were interacting only with their voice. So they will be going through those same steps, but that process is going to be greatly accelerated. We've talked a little bit about the challenges of applying a general music Kodaly approach in the violin setting. I want to pivot for just a moment over to the Suzuki side of things before coming back and talking a little bit more about the specific implementation about Kodaly in the Kaleidoscopes approach. Dr. Suzuki conceived of his program as being the mother tongue approach. He was inspired by the vision that every child learns to speak their native language fluently, and thought that it would be amazing if we could surround that child with the right parental supports and musical context to where they could learn to speak violin just the way that they learn to speak their native language. As a metaphor, this is incredibly inspiring. As an evidence-based teaching practice, there are some problems with that we need to be responsible for as teachers. The brain structures involved in learning a language are only slightly overlapping with those involved in understanding and making music. and the brain structures involved with playing an instrument are almost 100% different from either of those. So while a child might be able to copy a sound that their mother is making with some level of accuracy, and while they may be able to sing a short melody with fairly good accuracy that they've heard, walking over to a violin and being able to replicate a melody that they've seen played on violin is a whole nother ball game. So what this means is that when a child is supposedly learning by ear on the violin, they're not necessarily learning by ear. What's actually happening is they're learning by trial and error. Now, they do have a model of the song in their ear because they've been doing their CD listening. They know how the song goes, but in terms of being able to actually execute that on the violin, they're going to have to be hunting for notes, trying different ones, putting it together. So we call it a by ear approach, but really how it ends up working is it's a trial and error approach. This process is very frustrating for the typical young child. There may be a few really brilliant children that are able to progress at an acceptable rate in Book 1 by this method, but many children are going to experience a high level of frustration and move very slowly during this period, which is why often a caring and responsible Suzuki teacher is going to resort to some type of rote teaching to get that child through the literature a little bit more quickly and give them a sense of accomplishment and momentum. That rote method might be putting finger numbers in their part. It might be teaching the child the song phrase by phrase. Those are the most common ones. And it makes sense that they're doing this. In fact, every violin method that we've had, from the beginning of time, starting with Leopold Auer onward, has had a rote approach because that's just practically necessary for learning the violin. So given that there has traditionally been an element of rote learning in the violin study, what Kaleidoscopes does is it makes that rote element something that is inherently musical, which is the movable do solfege. Now, in the beginning, when the child hears that solfege, that child does not necessarily relate to, do, re, mi as being anything other than kind of some pretty nonsense syllables. However, over time and over repetition, as they're singing these syllables with the songs, there are some musical patterns that start to show up, and these solfege words are being paired with the same sounds over and over again, and the child's brain is very good at processing patterns. So they're starting to put together these sounds into, let's say, musical words, and recognize when certain patterns are showing up in many different contexts. In the meantime, that solfege is giving the child access to actually being able to perform almost the entire repertoire of Book 1, which, granted, it's a rote tool, but that's an incredibly powerful rote tool, and it really allows the child to make a high level of progress on their instrument at the same time that we're building some of those other literacy blocks underneath of them. So it's a rote tool that allows the child to get a larger view of the language that they're learning, and eventually all of those pieces come together for them. The literacy aspect of Kodaly consists of the 3 P's: prepare, present, and practice. I want to talk about what each of these means and then briefly show you how they're implemented in the Kodaly method. The prepare stage consists of hearing, singing, or playing songs that have the target concept embedded. For example, hearing or singing a song that has a dotted rhythm even before the child has learned what a dotted rhythm is. In the present stage, we build a bridge between the child's existing literacy knowledge and the new concept. This is typically a multi-step process that unfolds over several lessons. At each step of the process, the child has an opportunity to continue listening to and understanding that new melodic or rhythmic concept. In our dotted rhythm example, we would sing the song while keeping a steady beat and gradually call their attention to the fact that one of the notes is lasting longer than 1 beat but shorter than 2 full beats. Next, we might create a simple rhythmic ostinato while singing the song and help them notice how that rhythmic ostinato lines up with the beat. Next, we would draw the rhythm on the beat circles and show how that rhythm lasts over the course of 2 beats. And then finally, we would show how that rhythm is notated in the music. This is the formal presentation. The third P is the practice phase. This means using that new melodic or rhythmic concept in a variety of music, using it to improvise or compose, and reading unfamiliar music that contains that target concept. The prepare, present, practice sequence is at the heart of the Kodaly sound assemble approach. If you think about it, it's somewhat revolutionary compared to how a teacher might typically teach the same concept. We might tend to present the notation first, follow it by a mathematical explanation, and then finally demonstrate the sound of the rhythm. Part of the Kodaly training is making prepare, present, practice a natural part of your teaching. In Kaleidoscopes, the prepare phase is singing the songs and learning to play them on the piano and the violin. Now, it so happens that the way that the child is learning the songs is by memorizing the solfege from the recording. This doesn't allow the child to skip past the normal process of discriminating so me and all of that. It is simply a powerful, effective, and musical way for the child to build fluency on the violin. That said, 45 minutes a day of interacting with solfege is definitely going to accelerate the development of true musical literacy for that child. The conversational solfege approach of John Feierabend does a very similar thing. So, singing and playing the repertoire songs is the prepare phase in Kaleidoscopes. The present phase happens as the child works through lines and spaces, which follows a typical Kodaly sequence. It also happens in group class, which is very similar to a general music classroom and uses songs from Book 1 as well as other Kodaly teaching songs. The practice phase happens as the child learns to sight sing songs in lines and spaces, and later on learns to read songs on the violin. Memorizing repertoire songs is also a huge part of the practice phase in Kaleidoscopes. While it may seem on the surface that memorization is a rote activity, successful memorization in music and other subjects always involves making sense of patterns and bringing the content to a higher level of integration. As you can see, prepare, present, practice is present in Kaleidoscopes. It is implemented differently in Kaleidoscopes than it would be in a general music classroom due to the demands of learning the violin. However, the way that it's done allows the children to learn as much repertoire as they want. They have 24 songs to choose from, and they're using transposition as a tool to interact with the solfege, moving it from a rote tool to a genuine tonal map. If you've gone through the Kodaly training, what you'll find is that your training is mostly used in the group class and having the child work through lines and spaces. Those two environments are almost a pure Kodaly setting in contrast with the repertoire learning, which is a more blended approach.